Welcome to Japanese for Nikkei's Nikkei Spotlight series. My name is Mimi Okabe, and I'm one of the co-founders of JFN, who is currently on leave. Japanese for Nikkei is an online education platform for Nikkei learners of the Japanese language. So the Nikkei Spotlight series was created for our community to celebrate the voices of Japanese Canadians and Americans, as well as those who have connections to Japan, giving talks on their field of expertise. Our vision is to spread awareness about professionals in our communities, including but not limited to artists, authors, and academics who are breaking barriers and doing formative work to help raise awareness of a global Japanese diaspora. So if you have anyone in mind whom you'd like us to consider inviting in the future, please get in touch with us at connect@japanesefornikkei.com. Today, we are very humbled and so grateful to have Elysha Rei here with us to deliver her talk titled Archiving Nikkei Australian Identity in Contemporary Paper Cutting Art. And I'm also very, very thankful to a colleague in Australia who told me about Nikkei Australia. And through that initial contact, was able to get in touch with Elysha. So thank you again for coming today. I'll turn it over to Sachi to introduce Elysha, then we'll begin the presentation.
Thanks, Mimi. Hello, everyone. My name is Sachi Kikuchi, and I am also a co-founder of Japanese for Nikkei. Elysha Rei is the current chair of Nikkei Australia. Elysha is a Japanese-Australian artist that explores narratives of cultural identity, site-specific history, and environmental elements through paper cutting and public art. Her current PhD research is exploring how Nikkei Australian identity is archived through creative paper cutting practice. Rei has created and exhibited work, curated exhibitions, and managed cultural spaces internationally, and is the current chair of Nikkei Australia. Since 2023, Rei has been contributing as an artist fellow with the Past Wrongs, Future Choices Global Research Project based in Canada. So before we begin Elysha-san's talk, I would like to lay out the structure very briefly. We ask that you listen attentively and feel free to ask questions by typing them in the chat box. Just keep in mind that your questions will be addressed at the end of our speaker's presentation during the Q&A session. Please keep your mics muted while our speaker presents. We also ask that you keep questions respectful. Please also treat others with respect, love, and kindness. JFN has a zero tolerance policy against racism and other forms of discrimination and harassment. So, without further ado, Elysha-san, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Mimi and Sachi. It's a real pleasure to be invited to speak. And I'll say hi to Mike Abe, who I know through the Past Wrongs, Future Choices project in Canada, who has also generously given his time with my research. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands which I live and work in Brisbane, Australia, and that's the Turrbal and the Yagara peoples, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Thank you so much, Japanese for Nikkei, for having me be part of this wonderful series, and it's a real honor to share my work and my research. And thank you, Mimi, for helping me to share my slides. Next slide, please. So yes, Nikkei Australia has been instrumental in my research journey and really like identity journey. It's 10 years old this year, established in 2013, and we have a very close-knit community of 70 members who all have artistic and cultural, academic, educational, and engagement interests, and we do a lot of activities around that. But really, our mission is to promote the legacy of Japanese diaspora in Australia. And so after being in Canada earlier this year, it was quite inspirational to see how mobilized the Japanese Canadian community is. So I think that's something that I'd love to take Nikkei Australia in the direction of in future. Next slide, please. This is my grandmother, Akiko Kirkham. So this photo is probably taken in her early 20s in Osaka or Nara. And I lived abroad for a lot of my life and returned when I was in my early 20s. I was already a mum. And so that was really the first time that I got to spend a lot of time with her in one place. And I was able to ask her a lot about her life, learning about our ancestors, so she was very proud of, and also her telling me the story of when she met my Australian grandfather in Japan after World War II finished. So we became really close right up until she passed away in September last year. But that time that we had together for 7 or 8 years quite intensely was very precious. And of course, my eldest son got to spend a lot of time with her as well during that period. Next slide, please. So she was a Japanese war bride. So she met my Australian grandfather, who was a soldier in the British Commonwealth Occupation Forces, who were mobilized in Kure at the time after World War II. So she was one of 650 Japanese war brides that migrated to Australia. She did so in 1953, but all Japanese war brides came to Australia between 1952 and 1965. So it was quite an incredible period of time, really, because the White Australia policy was in effect since 1901, and that essentially barred all non-white migration to Australia right up until 1973, which had a lot of consequences. But this group of 650 Japanese war brides coming out from the 50s onwards really was like the catalyst for dismantling this very racist policy. So I think that we have a lot to be thankful for Japanese war brides really paving the way and doing so in a manner that was that had to be model minorities and really assimilate into Australian culture in order to represent their families and protect their children as well. So yeah, there's a lot of incredible history wrapped up within that, I think. The next slide, please. So this is my grandmother holding my mother. She made the papers for a couple of reasons. So she was the first baby born to a Japanese war bride in my state of Queensland. And when she was born, she was quite premature, several months premature. She was born on the Gold Coast, about an hour away from where we live in Brisbane. And she needed to be transferred to a bigger hospital that had better facilities. So she was in an ambulance on the way to Brisbane, and they ran out of oxygen in the ambulance. And at the time in 1954, Queen Elizabeth II was visiting Brisbane, and she was in the middle of her royal procession going over this bridge over the Brisbane River, and the ambulance had to stop the Queen in her procession to get over the bridge in time. So that made the news as well. So yes, Mum was famous from day dot. Next slide, please. So this is a photo of my grandmother, and my mum is on the far right of that picture on the left. Then she's got her younger sister in the middle and her older sister next to my grandmother, and that's their little brother in front of them. And there they are several decades later, all together again. So it was a really difficult time in the 50s and the 60s in Australia to have Japanese heritage. That White Australia policy was still in place, but also a lot of Australian POWs, prisoners of war, who were held captive, particularly in Thailand and Singapore, were coming home, and they had really awful stories of the atrocities of being held captive. So there was this growing anti-Japanese sentiment at that time. So I can imagine that it was a really difficult period for my grandmother, but also like my aunties and uncle and my mother, to be part Japanese. So my grandmother really protected them by just completely assimilating into Australian culture. So she didn't really pass on language. She didn't really pass on like cultural heritage and traditions and things like that. So it's only really now that, particularly after I've started on this my own research journey and sharing that with my mother, that we're kind of reflecting on almost a bit of a sense of loss in that as well, that generation of loss. But it's interesting how like my grandmother was able to pass a lot of that on to me that she wasn't able to give to my mother. But in turn, I'm passing that back to my mother. So it's sort of like gone full circle in a way. Next slide, please. I thought I'd share these photos. So this is my grandmother on the left with me, and that's with my mum on the right-hand side when I was a toddler. I'm definitely the only blonde baby in the family, so I've got my dad's genetics there, his English genetics. But interestingly enough, when my mum was back in the 80s, when I was born, people assumed that she was my nanny because I looked nothing like her. But as you can see, I've shared a very close bond with both of them. And so really that time when I was spending with my grandmother right up until she passed away, learning more about this history that I didn't know about, or even my mum didn't know about, to be honest, it really just inspired me to want to learn more and want to embrace and amplify these parts of our cultural heritage. So it was almost like this journey of reclamation of this identity, even identifying as Japanese Australian. Like I don't think I actually claimed that until I was in my mid-20s, where I felt comfortable to do that. But just saying that I'm Australian really just like cut out that whole part of my family and my grandmother's history and things like that. So I decided it was important to almost hyphenate it. And then also Rei is my middle name. We all have Japanese middle names, even all my aunties and mum and things like that. So that's when I started to use that professionally as well, was to identify that Japanese name as a really big part of who I am. Next slide, please. So what is paper cutting? So for those who don't know, it's literally about cutting pieces of paper out with a knife or scissors to create a picture like a stencil. So it's about using those spaces that are cut out in the paper to construct some sort of narrative. So I'm really interested in that sort of idea of positive and negative space, utilized both not just in the paper, but also in metaphor as well. I have started using a lot of archival records as starting points for my research, particularly since like finding my grandmother's immigration file. And I've been creating work that intertwines experience of Nikkei globally and connecting that with the past wrongs and future choices of these parallel histories, like between Australia, Canada, and the US at this point. So the archival records I use both as a point of visual stimulus, particularly like photographs and things like that, and also as reference materials too. Next slide, please. So it all started quite a long time ago. These works are in fact from my final year of art school back in 2007. So quite a while ago now. And I was really influenced by Takashi Murakami and his super flat style of painting. It's a very pop art kind of surrealist theme to it. And I was painting all these koinobori, the fish kites, because we always had them in our house. We moved quite a lot, but we'd always, my brother and I would use them to decorate our rooms, even beyond just Children's Day. So it like kind of became this repeated symbol. But I realized later on that the fish were always painted out of water. So here they've been held up in the air by balloons. And I think that was probably a reflection of how I felt, just a little bit out of place, not really quite knowing where I was fitting in, but also being quite transient with my family moving quite a lot. So for 3 years during art school, I experimented a lot with different things, but I had absolutely no clear focus. I just had a lot of fun just making things. But it's only really looking back now, almost 20 years later, that I can see that there was still that really strong Japanese influence in my work. Like it was still trying to connect to it or draw it out in some way. And then in the final year of art school, I had a workshop by a visiting artist who has Chinese Australian heritage, Dr. Megan Keating, and she came and did an artist talk and then showed us what paper cutting was in a workshop afterwards. And I had never heard of the medium before that point. And so had my first introduction to cutting things out of paper to create pictures. And at the time I thought, oh, this will be a fantastic tool to create stencils to make more super flat paintings because it will help to sort of like create really clean line work. So that's what I started doing initially. But then the interest started being more on the actual creation of the paper cut itself. And so the interest grew from there. And then I just started to challenge myself more and more with this medium. So creating more delicate and intricate designs, but also experimenting with scale as well, going larger or going really small as well. Next slide, please. So here we go. A few years later, the scale went extremely large. So on the left-hand side, you're seeing a giant double-headed koi fish paper cut that also joins to a white hokusai wave. And on the right-hand side, the black is actually a wall painting that it connects to. So 2011, this was when the town I was living in Queensland flooded terribly. It was also the same year that the Tohoku tsunami happened, and there was that threat of the nuclear meltdown with the power plant. So that is the reference to the double-headed fish as a comment on that. And the installation is called Destruction Creation. So it was a fusion of the paper cutting that I'd started to focus on, but also the painting practice that I'd had for a few years. And if we go to the next slide, you can see the full wall painting as well. So yes, it definitely references a lot of those Japanese elements. You can see probably the Hiroshima Peace Dome on the right-hand side there, and that's also a connection to that atomic nuclear threat at that point. And also it was where my grandmother was being on rotation as a high school student during the war, so she just missed out on being in Hiroshima that day, scarily enough. So yes, this was, I suppose, the beginning of trying to spread my wings with the paper cutting practice and painting in a way, but you can definitely see that this exploration of Japanese heritage and Japanese identity has made its way into my work. And then if we go to the next slide, the very following year, it just occurred to me for the first time to Google my ancestors, which was like, I'd never thought to do that. My grandmother had taught me all about our ancestors. So she was very proud of one of our daimyo ancestors was Katagiri Katsumoto, and he came from a samurai clan, and he has a really long and distinguished history. So she was always talking about him, even when I was a kid. He served in the Azuchi Momoyama period through the Edo period. And he was also famed as one of the 7 spears of Shizukatake during the Battle of Shizukatake in May 1583. So it's quite well-known history in Japan. So when I did Google image search him, these images came up of him in the ukiyo-e, Japanese woodblock print. And what first occurred to me was I thought it had that uncanny connection to the super flat aesthetic in the painting that I'd been interested in art school. But also what more so inspired me was how I was able to see an image of my ancestor as a descendant because it had been captured in art. There was that sense of longevity, like capturing a moment of him in history for later descendants to find. And that really brought home my sense of purpose as being a visual artist and the impact that that could have for later generations who may want to understand more about their history or their family and so forth. So yes, after seeing his portrait in this kind of style, it inspired another body of work for me. In the next slide, thank you. So this series was called Past Portraiture. So it was a return to that super flat style of painting, but now it was grounded with this connection to my ancestor who was featured in woodblock print. So it's a very suggestive self-portrait in the face, and there was a series of 12 paintings, all with this very similar style. And this kind of style of painting would also feature a couple of times later in a few years as I had some mural opportunities to come up with as well. So in the next slide, you'll see the scale goes very grand. So this was one of 9 murals that were sort of joined together from different cultures. And I think my space was about 5 meters high and 7 meters long, so 35 square meters of painting. And that super flat style returned once again. I had to conquer my intense fear of heights and get my license to operate a scissor lift in order to paint this. And the town that it's in is my university town in regional Queensland, in Toowoomba. So it was a lovely reason to sort of have a homecoming and place an artwork that's still there to this day. And if we look at the next slide, there's also a second artwork in Toowoomba, same sort of painted style, but this one's 8 meters high. And it's on the back of the regional art gallery in town. And it was really lovely to be invited to paint this because I used to volunteer there as a student on my Sundays when I was at art school. So once again, a very suggestive self-portrait featured in that style of ukiyo-e prints. And this was part of a street art festival that was painted. And yes, on the right-hand side, that tiny little brush, it was all painted. That tiny little brush. Yes, I was a little bit of a perfectionist. It's been a while since I've done murals, and maybe there's a reason why. If you look to the next slide, you'll see the finished painting, which is very, very hard to photograph because it's a very long, narrow kind of work. But yeah, it was an incredible privilege to paint that, and it's still standing on the side of the gallery, and people keep tagging me and on Instagram, so I get to see updates of it now and then, which is really lovely. If we go to the next slide, please. It was soon afterwards, I was living in Brisbane, where I currently am now, and I was invited to be part of the Bris Asia Festival. So that's the Brisbane Asia Festival. So it's an annual event. It's run by our local council, and it celebrates Asian culture in Brisbane. And it was a really incredible moment for me because it was the first time that I was recognised as being part of Brisbane's Asian diaspora community. So for this project, I had to do an ephemeral installation in a laneway. So it was only allowed to last for 2 weeks. But it had to last 2 weeks with all the weather. And then it had to be completely removed afterwards. So what you can see here are some hand-cut vinyl pieces that were installed onto the windows in the laneway of a couple of businesses that were along there. And obviously the koi fish, or the fish in general, is still connecting to my work there. And then the next slide, you'll see there was also some works that were put onto the roadside as well. So the bottom left-hand side, these were created by firstly making a paper cut stencil and then spraying construction paint onto it, which washes off. It's like a chalk paint. And then on the right-hand side, really, really large paper cuts that were pasted down onto the road of this laneway, and they were later cleaned off with a pressure cleaner. So yes, it was an incredible experience to think about different materials that I had to use to fit the brief of being ephemeral, but having to last the elements for that long. And then also to work outside in a different sense was really exciting. The next slide, please. So these are another series of paper cuts that began a few years later. They were created in red as a symbol of power and strength. So at the end of 2017, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. I'm totally free of it now. But during that time, I drew a lot of strength on my samurai ancestor being a warrior, and kind of took on this sort of sense of strength from being like a cancer warrior in a sense. And so I was creating artworks in hospital while I was doing chemo treatments and things. And then when I was well enough, I picked up a blade again and was paper cutting armor that I had researched was worn by warriors at that same time period that he was serving. So these were all created in a residency at the end of my big treatment year at the end of 2018. I was really lucky enough to get a fellowship to be funded to go to Japan in Kyushu and spend 6 weeks as an artist just creating these works to then exhibit them afterwards. And it really just gave me a fantastic thing to work towards through all of my treatments earlier that year. But then once I got there, to then have a chance to sort of process everything and reflect, and really just sort of get it all out of my system, literally by creating these really intricate paper cutting works. And if you go to the next slide, what was even more special about that moment was that it just so happens that in Kyushu, I have relatives there. And my grandmother knew I was going to do this residency and was there for a couple of months. So she rang them up. I had never met them before. And she said, my granddaughter's going to be there. You have to look after her. So they came to my exhibition in Itoshima, where the residency was. And so I met all of my second cousins and aunties and uncles, third cousins as well. And yeah, they came and joined me for the opening. And then later they also invited me to spend a weekend at their place in Oita, a couple of hours away. And it was an incredible moment because I'd never met my relatives before, but it was like instant kinship, instant family connection, just to be fully embraced. We shared, and even though there was language barriers, like I can't speak Japanese fluently, I think only one family member could speak English to a point where we could sort of get by quite easily with coordination and logistics with travel and things like that. But that didn't matter. We had this really beautiful exchange of meals, and they taught me how to whisk matcha and play the shamisen, and it was just an unforgettable time. And the other family member that I met, who's not in this picture, was my great auntie, so my grandmother's older sister, who became a little bit of a mother figure to her because my grandmother was orphaned by the time she was 10, I think, when her father also died. And so her older sister really was more of a maternal figure for her, but they hadn't seen each other for such a long time with the distance. And my great auntie was quite unwell. So she was in a nursing home and she was completely blind. But she knew who I was. They explained who was visiting her, and she just took my hands. And there's this beautiful photo of us together where she just understood the connection to her. And yeah, it was just absolutely unforgettable. And they videoed it for my grandmother, and she got to see it later. So yes, I think what this experience did for me, apart from this beautiful connection to relatives that I still have, is that it really, it kind of made that connection to Japan quite visceral, because I know a lot of other Nikkei that I talk to feel like this, almost like this sense of homesickness for Japan, even though they may not have been born there, they may not have lived there, but it's like this, I think it's this blood connection to the land. And then to have family there that recognize you as kin, I think that just sort of validates that feeling that there is this real connection to the country. And in the next slide, it was a real privilege to then take those works to Tokyo. And it was always my dream to have an exhibition in Tokyo somewhere. So they were up for a week in this gorgeous little space called Number 12 Gallery in Shibuya. And all the paper cuts that I made during the residency were able to be displayed in this gorgeous show there. And it was a great chance to meet people that were walking by and dropping in who were interested to see what was going on. In the next slide, you'll see that there are some photographs that I took during my time in Japan. I was really fortunate enough to do a bit of a pilgrimage of family history. So before I left, my grandmother mapped out a whole bunch of places that she recommended I visit. And they were connected to like the birthplace of our ancestors, but also where our grandparents met, where they got married. So making my way from Kyushu, from the residency, all the way up to Tokyo, where I had that show, it took me several days because I was taking this long way, dropping in at all these sort of places. Even in Shiga Prefecture, I was walking on foot by the end to try and find these really obscure locations. And walking on foot, I kept coming across these beautiful manhole covers in the roads and the pavements, and they were always very different in each city. And so I was photographing them, not really knowing why at the time, but they just interested me. And then if we go to the next slide, about a year later, they ended up being a new series of works. So all those patterns got translated into paper cuts. And what you probably won't tell by these photographs is the scale. So they're quite large. Each is about 1.5 meters in diameter. So almost as tall as me when I hold them up. And I named the series Furusato, which means hometown. And it's a concept around nostalgia for the past and a nostalgia for place. And all the works together, 12 of them, are all named by the place that that pattern was photographed from. And so when you collectively put them together, it kind of maps this journey of pilgrimage through these different places that my grandmother had recommended I went to. And it also connects to that feeling that I felt during that time and that Furusato nostalgia for the past. And it's also the name of a song that same great auntie that I met, she used to sing to my grandmother when she was a child. So it all sort of wrapped up and connected really beautifully together. Next slide, please. So I'm at the end of my second part-time year of my PhD in creative practice, which is technically my first year. And that's investigating how Nikkei Australian identity can be archived through contemporary paper cutting. So I think paper has a memory like archives, like the decisions and actions of what we cut and mark and fold and roll in the paper are represented on it. And like an archivist has to choose what to keep and cut out to create an archive, a paper cutting artist has to do the same to choose what pieces of paper to cut out and what pieces of paper stay in the material to create some sort of narrative within it. Next slide, please. So this installation is called Yo Hakunobi, and this was the first installation that I created during candidature. It translates to the beauty of empty space, it's basically the story of my grandparents' relationship who found love in the aftermath of war. So they really inspired it in terms of creating a space of peace and calm and tranquility, and really recognizing that diplomacy like between two former enemies of Japan and Australia, and honoring that contribution that Japanese war brides made to changing the landscape migration in Australia. Next slide, please. So the koi fish is still in there, but this time it's found water. So those circles around the fish are inspired by Japanese sand garden water lines. And I think that really spoke to the sense of that journey that I had been on and gotten to a place where like I'd found connection to family, connection to place, and I felt like I had a better sense of who I was. And interestingly enough, the koi fish is also quite a strong metaphor, not just for Japanese culture visually, but it is a species that's illegal to keep in my state of Queensland. They're considered a pest. So there's a little bit of ambivalence of displacement sort of wrapped up in there, but also strength and resilience because koi fish always swim against the current as well. Next slide, please. So this installation also features bonsai trees, and they're created from reference photos of our local botanic gardens, and each is cut from one single piece of paper, and you can see on the left it just hangs upside down, refusing to let go of the paper that it was cut from. And I like to think that that references my grandmother's experiences of assimilating into Australian culture, however, never completely letting go of her connection to Japan. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see another example there. So bonsai, sorry, you can see down the bottom, there's also remnants of little pieces of paper. So these were collected from all the little tiny cutouts of the branches on the right-hand side there. I used to just throw out all the little paper confetti bits that were created during my work, but I decided in the series to actually keep them and make them be a valuable part of the work, and likened them to be like cultural remnants of our family history that we're sort of gathering up and collecting and safekeeping, and it represents that. And what you can also see in the work is that there's the void that the tree was cut from, there's the tree itself hanging upside down, and there's that little pile of paper underneath. So there's these 3 active spaces in the work, and I want that to represent that third space of mixed race identity that we have a connection to, I think, within the Nikkei community as well. Next slide, please. So you can see there that that's the reference photograph that I took of the bonsai, and those are the little tiny cuts being created with a knife, taking many, many hours for some of those really detailed trees. And the next slide, please. So on this work here is a really one close to my heart. So it's called Rabbit Proof Fence. And it began the moment that I discovered my grandmother's immigration file at the National Archives here. So her arrival in 1953 was not long after our former Minister for my immigration, Arthur Caldwell, said in 1948, "No Japanese women or any half-castes either will be admitted to Australia. They are simply not wanted and are permanently undesirable." And when I read that the first time, I was just shocked. Like, I just couldn't believe how awful that was at the time, but also how much things have changed in Australia. Next slide, please. So when thinking about that label, permanently undesirable, rabbits come to mind in our state because they are also a pest here. They were introduced with the first fleet of convicts in 1788 from England, and then they really quickly populated and damaged the soil and the land. So what they did in Western Australia was they literally built a rabbit-proof fence all the way like north to south across the country to try and keep out these rabbits. And the construction of that fence began in 1901, which is the same year that that Immigration Restriction Act, or White Australia policy, came into effect. So this work is a replica of that wire fencing that was used to keep rabbits out. But it's also an allegory of that policy, of the White Australia policy, trying to keep my grandmother and other Japanese war brides out of the country, and that social and political barriers that they faced when they were trying to reunite with their husbands in Australia. There's a little tiny rabbit there on the left-hand side, and that is got the record of my grandmother's alien registration card on there. And you'll probably notice on the left-hand side, there's a hole that's been cut out of the fence. So that is a suggestion that, yes, my grandmother rabbit ended up creating a hole in this fence that eventually led to its complete dismantling in 1973. So when you think about it, yeah, this work is like an ironic interpretation of the White Australia policy, which was essentially a fence made of paper. I know I haven't got a lot of time, so I'm just going to breeze through the last few slides here. So the next one, please, as we get to Canada early this year. So my Nikkei experience was globalized when I spent a gorgeous couple of months in Victoria, BC, as artist in residence for Passerong's Future Choices. And that is a project focusing on illuminating Nikkei histories across all allied countries, including Australia, Canada, the US, and Brazil, who all have shared histories of Japanese diaspora communities who were interned or incarcerated during World War II. Next slide, please. So during the residency, I found myself drawn to a lot of oral histories and historical images that referenced invasive species. And these provided this really powerful allegorical connection to these histories of incarceration and internment. So I began to make studies of these in paper. So this particular one pictured is called colt's foot, or Japanese butterbur, and it's otherwise known in Japanese as fuki. It was introduced to Canada in the 1920s by Japanese Canadians migrating over, and it became really common in gardens in the 1930s. It's a native to Japan and has these beautiful flowers that bloom in early spring, and then later these huge leaves appear in the summertime. And if you see in the next slide, there's a work that references some of those beautiful sort of colt's foot shaped leaves that come up. So I discovered that these plants were grown and eaten on the West Coast during early Japanese Canadian community history, and then they were uprooted and transplanted and taken to internment camps, just like the Japanese Canadian communities that had cultivated them. So they were harvested for food, either pickled or deep fried or sauteed in different dishes. And in the next slide, you'll see it's got this really interesting root system as well. So the plant is still classed as invasive in a lot of provinces in Canada. And it's really interesting how the plant shares a really racialized immigration history, much like the Japanese Canadian community. Like even some of the language that I've seen used against Japanese diaspora references things like being invasive and biologically inferior, like you would be talking about a plant or an animal, which just absolutely blows my mind. And then in the next slide, this next study was sparked by references of barbed wire used in internment camps in the US and Australia. So I just wanted to recreate barbed wire in hand-cut washi paper on the left-hand side there. And what happened was it just had this really interesting ambivalence towards it. Like barbed wire is so hostile and very harsh, but then suddenly it became this really gentle, tactile kind of object because it was created in this really soft, beautiful washi paper. And I think that ambivalence of this was what I kept coming across in my research. Instances of strength alongside fragility within the Japanese Canadian community, for instance. Yeah, so it's something that I want to keep exploring within my work with this reference. And then the next slide sort of shows all these elements from my residency put together. So you've got the barbed wire around the circle and then the fuki leaf and the flower on the inside. And it's created in black and white in that circular design to reference the kamon, Japanese family crest. So it really connects to that sense of identity as well. In the next slide, sort of pivot away into a different direction with the residency. You may not realize that this is an image that references a photograph of that was taken in an Australian internment camp. And it's a Japanese garden that was created by Japanese internees back during World War II. If you go to the next one, you'll see the reference image that I used to cut it from. So I've eliminated some of the detail in the background there, and I really wanted to hone in on the craftsmanship of the garden and the bridge and the stonework and the waterwork, just to create this beautiful image to sort of lure people in and then reveal the history behind it. So the next slide shows the process where I was literally cutting into a copy of the record, and there was a piece of black paper behind it. And so this also took me in this direction of forcing me to look at the record more closely and discover hidden details that I actually didn't realize on just first glancing at it. And the next slide, you can see a couple of other works in that series where these photographs that were taken in the camps of these beautiful Japanese gardens and structures have that ambivalence about it, that beauty of these structures and that craftsmanship, but situated in these situations of racial persecution. Just a couple more slides to go, sorry. The next one is a picture of my grandmother, and I wanted to circle back to that connection to Japanese for Nikkei. This is a picture of her working at the University of Queensland, where she helped to set up the School of Languages and Culture in Japanese. And that is her working the Japanese typewriter, and she was the only one that could actually use it. It's really, really complicated with 500 plus characters on it. And then Dr. Yuriko Nagata, who I think's just joined the session, she was very generous enough to spend the time and her connections at UQ to find the typewriter in the archives and gift it back to my grandmother. So the next slide, you can see her on her 94th birthday, and she receives the typewriter and like recognizes it and instantly lights up because she has such fond memories of working at the university on that program. She made all the textbooks with that typewriter, did all the lesson plans and things. And even though she had a little bit of dementia at that time of her life, it just took her straight back to that moment. It was absolutely beautiful. So that language program ended up being piloted as a curriculum addition to all primary schools and high schools in Australia. And that's something that I ended up studying in school. And now my teenage son is studying Japanese. So it's come full circle, which is gorgeous. And lastly, the next slide, continuing about language, we just had our Koseki Tohon translated to find out more about our family history, even discovering that there's another Koseki Tohon to find because we didn't realize there was a divorce and a diversion of records. So we're aiming to find this second Koseki when we return to Japan next year in March and continue this journey of family history discovery. And that brings me to the last slide. Yes, thank you so much for listening.
Elysha, thank you so much for that talk and for sharing all of your experiences and your connection and reconnection to all of the different aspects of art and family. Thank you so much for that. It was so interesting and so heartwarming. Arigatou gozaimasu.
Thank you very much, Elysha, for that wonderful talk. I have a question, but before Sachi or I maybe ask any questions, we'd like to open it up to the floor.
Yes, I have a question, if that's okay. Well, first, I'd like to say thank you very much for your very nice presentation. So interesting. Your artist work is so gorgeous. And are you thank you. I'm just wondering if do you think it's possible to bring your art exhibition in Canada? Because I would love to see it.
I have a work at the Japanese Canadian Cultural Centre at the moment. It's up until May. There's a beautiful installation there that they asked me to create for their 60th anniversary. So it's a large sakura, like branches with the flowers there. And then I'm trying to hopefully bring a show there next year. I'm just applying at a couple of other places. So if I do, I'll let you know.
Sounds good. Thank you.
I do have a question, but if Michael or Mimi, if either of you would like to go ahead, that's totally fine.
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So thanks, Mimi, for letting me ask my question first. Elysha, you have done so many public installations and shared so much of your work publicly. I'm curious to know which one of all the ones that you've done, which one sort of stands out to you the most and maybe has made the biggest impact on you in, in whatever way?
That's a great question. And I think I know how to answer it. I think as it stands, it would be the rabbit-proof fence work. That was commissioned for a show, but it kind of forced me to take my work in a new direction where I think for the first time I had a bit more of a political stance in terms of the connection to historical legislation and things like that. So I felt like I had found my voice as an artist. But the other part of it was that I did start the work over a year ago, and it took me like 6 months to complete, which is very unusual for me. Normally I just sort of focus and get it all done. But I found it because I had such a connection to my grandmother. It had her record literally featured in it. I found it actually really emotionally challenging to make it, as well as like physically challenging to like create this huge fence. And then my grandmother actually passed away while I was in the middle of making it. So I didn't want to finish making it because I felt like it was this connection to her somehow. But there was a deadline that I had to meet. But I think because it was so hard to get through it for all these reasons, it's one that's like really close to me. Yeah, definitely.
Thanks so much for sharing that. Thank you.
Michael, we see your face now. Did you want to ask a question or a comment?
Sorry, I'm on my iPad, so I'm very uncomfortable with the cameras and everything. So, but great Wonderful to hear you talk again, Elysha. I've heard many of those stories while you were here in Victoria. So just great to hear those again and see your works again. Thank you very much for doing the presentation.
Thank you, Mike, for joining, and thank you so much for listening and supporting my work as always.
If nobody else has any questions or comments, if it's okay if I ask mine, I write my things down. So I'm sorry, I'm going to be reading. So I really appreciate how your art expresses your trepidation with your ancestral heritage identity, but also like a celebration of it and a preservation of it for your own like future family. I find that really, really beautiful. I think your artwork really symbolizes strength and resilience, and I'm very thankful to have learned so much today from your art and also from your presentation. My question is about your use of spaces. So one thing that I noticed in most of your installation pieces with using the paper cutting art is the use of shadows. And I'm just wondering like how you interpret or make sense of the shadow space in your artwork, if
Yeah,
that matters.
well, thank you so much for your beautiful comments and your question as well. I think the shadow is something that I don't think about at the very beginning of a work, but I think it becomes important when it's finished and I'm thinking about how to display it. I think it's got a lot of depth to its meaning in terms of like, I have an agenda of illuminating histories and illuminating stories, so bringing things out of the shadow. But then it's kind of interesting that the works create their own shadows, and there's a lot of shadow play involved. So I generally like to display works that are sort of away from a wall so that that depth creates shadow when the light shines through it. So also people can see that it's actually more 3D rather than 2D as well. But yeah, it's something that I would like to explore further, is actually from the very beginning thinking about how light and shadow might really play in creating and finishing a work, right up until it's ready to display somehow. Yeah.
Thank you. And if it's okay if I ask one more question, you
Yes.
talked about the use of like washi in your artwork, but I was just wondering, is there like a material or kind of paper that you prefer to use in your art? And if so, what might that be?
That's a great question, because there's a couple of different papers that I use. So the washi paper was interesting. I only really started to use that when I came to Canada. So when I was there earlier this year. Yeah, so I bought that washi paper while I was there and created those works during the residency. When I started to go large scale, I needed to buy really large rolls of paper, because I don't know if I made it quite clear, but all of my works are made of one piece of paper. There's not multiple papers like joined together. So the challenge with making large work is that you have to find large rolls of paper. So I didn't want to break the bank with fine art supplies, which can be really expensive. So I actually was using photographic backdrops that you find in like studios. You know how you get different sort of colors behind people's portraits and things like that? They're actually rolls of paper. So I was buying like rolls of photographic studio backdrops, which the company must have thought I had like this huge warehouse or something for photography, but I was cutting into them. And then I pivoted about 3 years ago to another material and started to use a synthetic polymer paper, which is also waterproof and tear-proof. So you can cut into it, but you can't just grab it and rip it. And the beauty of that, particularly in Queensland, which is a very subtropical climate, we have really high humidity. When it rains, all the paper just buckles and ripples, is that this synthetic paper doesn't do that. It just retains its shape. You can roll it up and then it lays flat again. So it doesn't have as much of a memory, which is a bit of a play on that as well. But it's a lot more durable. So the rabbit-proof fence was made out of this synthetic paper because it's also traveling in a show. So they need paper to be a little bit more hardy to endure traveling and going to different venues and things. Yeah.
All right. So if nobody else has any questions, again, I want to thank Elysha for coming to Japanese for Nikkei's Spotlight series again. Thank you so much. Sachi, would you like to say any last words?
Yeah, Elysha, thank you again. Just reiterating what Mimi said for not only for sharing your time with us, but your expertise, your experience, and just bringing everything that you've had that's led up to this place with us and sharing it today. It's been so interesting to learn about everything over the past approximate hour. So I have so many more questions and would love to learn more. So
Right.
I'm hoping that, there's a way maybe that we can connect or stay up to date on your work. So maybe just before we close up for the day, if
Yeah,
there's any like
absolutely.
upcoming projects or ways to connect with you, keep updated with your work that you can share with us, that would be amazing.
Thank you so much, Sachi. And yeah, happy to answer any questions after the session. So I've just put my website and my Instagram handle there. So that's the best way to stay in touch. And anyone can DM me or email me with questions. Always happy to answer them. And thank you so much for having me. I think the Japanese for Nikkei mission is incredibly valuable. And I think the work that you do is so important. And I'm very happy to be part of this conversation. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for joining, for being here today. And thanks everyone, I guess, who watches the recording as well.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
ありがとうございます。